really excited that you all are here. I know many of you, but not all of you. My name is Carrie Filippetti. I'm the executive director of the Vandenberg Coalition, which is an organization here in DC that believes in a strong and proud U.S. foreign policy. We've been hosting these events with members of Congress and policymakers over the last few years, really to try to gain a better understanding of how conservatives are thinking about the future of America's role in the world at a moment where that question really seems to be changing. And so today I'm really thrilled to be speaking with Congressman John Moolenaar, who, like our namesake, for those of you who know the name Vandenberg, Senator Arthur Vandenberg, is proudly from Michigan, with a long and distinguished career in public service. He began his career as a chemist, which I think is a little bit more unusual for members of Congress. He then worked in business development and then as a school administrator. And I would say, I think that these are actually very relevant for this conversation because it has a lot to do with the different areas where China is trying to influence us as it relates to supply chains, pharmaceuticals, as well as higher education. He received his master's degree in public administration from Harvard University. He served in the Michigan House of Representatives and then the Michigan State Senate. And then in 2014, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, where he has served ever since and currently represents Michigan's 2nd Congressional District. He is also a member of the House Appropriations Committee and co-chair for the Congressional School Choice Caucus. Most important for our discussion today is that Congressman Moolenaar is the chairman of the House Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. I'm going to call that the China Select Committee, as everybody here does. I always forget its actual name because it's so long. But in this role, he leads efforts to counter the economic and national security threats that are posed by the Chinese Communist Party. And under his leadership, the committee continues to be a leading voice combating the CCP's influence and raising awareness about the threats that it poses to the American people. So Congressman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. And you'd mentioned Arthur Vandenberg. You know, it's interesting because when I first came to Congress, I have a Dutch heritage and live in the West Michigan area. And we had an author, Henk Meyer, who came and spoke to it was a gathering of the Dutch caucus and others about his new book on Arthur Vandenberg. And so I got the book, I read the book, and really interesting history and kind of how he developed as a foreign policy leader. And I think his insights are very relevant. So I'm honored to be here with you today and to be part of the discussion.
Thank you so much. It is a book that everybody should read. We don't make any money from the sale of this book, but it's called The Man in the Middle of the American Century, and it's by Henk Meyer, who we're huge fans of. And actually, that book inspired the Vandenberg Coalition. So I'm very grateful that you brought that up. So again, everybody should read that book. So let's get into it. The threat that China poses to the United States is obviously incredibly multifaceted. There's the fentanyl threat that it provides by providing precursors to cartels in Mexico. There's the economic threat that it poses, the threat to our defense base, to our higher education, trade practices. Can you give us a sense, as you think about the current state of play, how do you assess what the, quote, China challenge really means?
Well, you covered so many of the areas, but I'll tell you what, in my view, the China challenge is to help Americans understand this threat in a way that's very different than our thinking of maybe the last 30 years. You know, I grew up in a little town in Michigan, big manufacturing town, and I still remember 25 years ago, the goal was this China market is going to be huge. It's going to be so beneficial. They're going to become more freedom-loving, more, democratic, and they are going to be great, responsible players throughout the world. And, that was the hope. That was the aspiration. They were a developing country, and we wanted to help them be successful. And you look at what has happened under Xi Jinping in particular, and it's been a very different dynamic. I would say most Americans are not aware of the differing reality versus aspiration. And so one of our goals as a committee is to really shine a spotlight on this relationship that we have with China and look at human rights, look at economic, national security, technology, all these different areas where China has a very deliberate strategy, and they are marching along with this strategy, and most of us as Americans are not able to focus on that on a day-to-day basis. We're still thinking in some of the same ways we have. And so, you know, as people become more aware of it, and I will say one of the things that China did recently was, you know, threatening the restriction of these rare earth materials. That was a wake-up call, I think, particularly to the private sector, to the business community, but also as Americans understand what that would have meant for your cell phones, your automobiles, your computers, you know, you just across the board, and how even some of our leading automotive manufacturers are saying, yeah, we could last without this for maybe a couple weeks before this would really impact our manufacturing. So to me, that is a wake-up call, but if you say, how far did that penetrate in the knowledge of all of us as Americans? Not far enough.
Well, and speaking on partially your ability to describe this threat to the American public, we've been doing polling every month, and every month consistently we see over 70% of Americans are deeply concerned about the threat that China poses specifically to the technology question. So I think that's really helpful to know. I'd like to kind of focus on this, the export controls of rare earths that you brought up. Considering how important critical minerals and rare earths are for our lifestyle, what are the best steps that America can take to really counter these types of predatory practices? So China walked back some of their restrictions, but what are things that the United States can do going forward?
Well, first we have to recognize that it's temporary that they are relenting on this. And we have to also realize that what they proposed was not something they came up with over the weekend, but it was something that had been years in the making, developing a policy on how to leverage their advantage in rare earths. And they do this across a lot of spheres. And typically what they do is they will develop a capacity, you know, sometimes they'll steal technology, sometimes they'll acquire it and develop an ability to scale it up, and then heavily subsidize, manipulate pricing to drive others out of business. And especially people who are trying to get into the business, they'll find ways to drive them out by manipulating prices. And that's something that they are willing to not only develop this dominance, but they're willing to leverage it, as they showed, but even further, they will weaponize it. And you can, probably the best public example of this right now is, you know, the first country they did this to was Japan, in my recollection, and could have been a decade ago. And it was involving fishing, and China decided to push back and started leveraging this critical minerals, rare earth. Well, if you followed, the Prime Minister of Japan recently said that, you know, if China invaded Taiwan, that would be a huge threat to Japan. If you look at the pushback that even right in Japan, the Chinese embassy there basically said that, you know, cut off the head of the person who sticks their nose in where it doesn't belong. And, you know, they're trying to find ways to partner with Russia to clap back on this. Now, to me, it's a pretty obvious statement that the Prime Minister made, and very authentic, and nothing new about what they said. But when you see the severity of this wolf warrior diplomacy and the willingness to just go right after in a violent way, it shows you the willingness to leverage things. And you know, you have to remember that the first country they tried to leverage these rare earths was against Japan, and now they're doing it for the world. They've given us a 1-year reprieve, but I anticipate them running that play over and over again as long as it serves their interests.
One of the other areas that they seem to be weaponizing is fentanyl. So obviously, President Trump has made it very clear that he's interested in combating drug trafficking into the United States. And while we know that Maduro is a narco-terrorist, and I have personal experience trying to fight against Nicolas Maduro, the reality is a lot of the actual precursors for fentanyl, which is killing Americans, are coming from the Chinese Communist Party. What additional action should we be taking to hold China accountable for those American deaths?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because one of the things our committee did in a bipartisan way was did an investigation on the fentanyl precursors, because you always heard that China was involved with the fentanyl issues, but we really needed evidence.
And they incentivized it, as your report showed.
Exactly. What we showed is not only were they turning a blind eye, they were actually incentivizing it to create these precursors to export. Now, if they couldn't sell them in China, but if they exported them, they'd get a tax rebate. And so when we came out with that report, it took a while for it to kind of gain acceptance. It seems pretty hard to believe that a government would actually be doing that, especially after Xi Jinping had told President Biden, hey, we'll help you with your drug problem, I was really pleased when the Trump administration came out and said, we're going to put tariffs directly related to fentanyl, and that was a key negotiation that they received a commitment from Xi Jinping on. Now, it's always the case where they will make a commitment. The question is, will they keep their commitment? I'm not convinced there's the integrity to do that. So we need to really keep monitoring and making sure they're held accountable for their promises.
I want to ask a little bit about trade. So at the summit in October between Trump and Xi, trade was one of the major points of discussion. Some say we should decouple, some say we should de-risk. What do these terms mean, and sort of where do you fall on this?
I've never been, I think China is not going away. And I think we need a relationship with China. And I've never been someone who says, you can't buy, certain products from China. But when you look at some of the strategic sectors, the question is, do we want to be vulnerable and dependent on China? And to what extent do we want them accessing our capabilities in the United States? So when it comes to autonomous vehicles, I think it was really important that we drew a line and said we do not want Chinese autonomous vehicles mapping, the United States and we don't want to become dependent on them for other technologies. I think the rare earths and different things. At the same time, we also, whether it's semiconductors, right now we are ahead in this AI race, if you will, because we have the hardware, we have the more advanced chips. I think it's really important that we don't give them access to our best technologies, and we control that. And we want to work with like-minded countries and reliable partners that we can depend on. At the same time, they're going to try and create a dominance in the lower-end semiconductors, and they're already doing that. They're going to create all sorts of excess capacity, and they will try and drive out our businesses out of business, just like they're doing with minerals, to manipulate prices, subsidize through state-sponsored action to try and drive people out of business. But you have to realize in those areas, even though they're not the high-end chips, we are dependent. And if we have our companies who can't make money here doing that, we will lose that, and then we will become vulnerable to their capabilities. And so it's tricky, because I'm a believer in free markets for free people, but when you have a government that's deliberately manipulating prices and manipulating supply, and to the point of unfair trade practices, we have to respond in a way that protects our national interests.
Speaking of chips, somebody else who is, I think, here on Capitol Hill today, or at least this week, is NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang, who recently said that the China Hawk label, which I think you accept proudly, is actually a badge of shame. And I just would love to hear your reactions to that comment.
Well, we don't agree on that. We met with Jensen Huang, and he's a very likable, personable, obviously very successful business person. But at the end of the day, his job is to sell as many chips as possible. I mean, how he is evaluated is, what are his returns? And, he talks about having the American technology be the tech stack across the world. And I think there's a point in that. But we have to realize, when has that ever worked to partner with China to have this partnership around the world? And how has that worked out in the past? And the reality is, it hasn't worked with China, because their goal, just like it is with other industries, will be to gain the best technology, figure out a way to scale it, and drive Jensen out of business. Now, he may see tremendous profits for a short period of time, the more chips he can sell in China, but the reality is, it's not in our national security interests. It's actually not even in the interests of the private sector, because short-term gains, long-term loss. Now, does he believe that? No, but all of his incentives are very different than ours as Americans that say, okay, how can we continue to stay ahead in these areas that are relevant to our national security, and also make sure that we're having business dealings with countries that play by the rules, that there are fair trade practices. And on both counts, selling high-end chips to China, I think, fails that measure.
Well, and speaking of what happens when you try to collaborate with China, your committee also released a different report separate from the fentanyl report that really highlighted how the Pentagon has funded research projects with Chinese universities that created technologies that could really benefit the Chinese military and directly harm American service members. Can you explain how things like your Safe Research Act and other programs that we can implement to prevent something like this from happening?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I tend to love, we have some great universities in our country. It's sort of the envy of the world in many respects. I grew up in a family, my father was a PhD chemist. I still remember him talking about how, scientists share information. It benefits the world as, competition, publishing, all the different things that are good about research. And there's a lot of truth to that. At the same time, we have to look at, where do we put our taxpayer dollars? And who are we educating? And who are we partnering with? And how is that benefiting either our economy or our national security? So we did a report that showed our leading research universities getting grants from Energy, Department of War, and they had joint institutes with Chinese institutes that partnered with the Chinese military. And so you have to ask, okay, if we're doing research on hypersonics or different advanced technologies that have dual use applications, does that really benefit us to partner with Chinese entities that are directly partnering with the People's Liberation Army? And, some people say, well, if it's, the private sector or the university agrees they're not going to share this with the army in China. The reality is their national security laws force that to happen. So when they pass their national security laws, it basically says any entity, any individual has to do basically whatever the Chinese Communist Party directs them to do, or they're in violation of their national security laws. And so, fortunately, as we raise this issue, Cal Berkeley, Georgia Tech, University of Michigan, there were many universities then that discontinued these programs. Those programs, again, were started with the idea of, we want to help a developing, responsible nation rise economically, and it's going to be a win-win for everybody. Again, the fundamental assumptions of that have been proven wrong, and we have to recognize this new reality. And so those funds need to be cut off, and we have to recognize, because of China's unique national security laws, we don't want to look at every Chinese national with suspicion, but we have to realize that they are highly vulnerable to leverage from the Chinese Communist Party, either they or their families. And our committee hears all the time from people who have faced that persecution on our shores by the long reach of the Chinese Communist Party.
And we saw that both with Chinese Students and Scholars Associations on universities where they harassed Chinese nationals and their families back home, and also the sort of those police stations that they were setting up across the United States and across some other countries as well. Okay, we can't talk about Chinese malign influence without talking about TikTok. So we at the Vandenberg Coalition, as many people know, have been very supportive of Congress's efforts to ensure that the CCP has no control over the algorithm of TikTok. We recently did a poll that showed that 66% of Trump voters believe that the terms of the deal that was supposedly worked out need to be made public because of the national security risks involved. You've been a very vocal supporter of the idea that the TikTok algorithm be out of the CCP's hands as well. What do you know about the terms of the deal, and what are the things that you're going to be looking out for to make sure that Americans, the 170 million Americans that use this app, are safe while they're using it?
That's a great question. And I would say we've had different briefings of the deal in process. So I cannot adequately describe what the final deal is. I can tell you I'm in 100% agreement that we need to have transparency and we need to have oversight in Congress, and I've pledged, we are expecting a full briefing by the White House, and we plan to have oversight hearing that would directly, respond to that. I appreciate that it's a very difficult deal to make. Ultimately, China, Xi Jinping had the final say on anything having to do with keeping TikTok viable in America. Had he said, I'm willing to, put it on the market, whoever bids, whatever deal, that's one thing. He specifically wanted to keep ByteDance in the mix. And for those of you who don't follow this, ByteDance is the Chinese company, the ownership. And clearly in the law, it says ByteDance cannot have control. And so you have American investors in ByteDance. You have other investors who are now part of this deal. And then ByteDance itself could be up to 19%. I'm not really comfortable with any, recommendation algorithm influenced by ByteDance. So that's the first question we have is, to what degree is there control from ByteDance? And so to me, it's not a done deal. The president very clearly said his goal was to continue to make it available for Americans. And so I do believe they've been working in good faith to come to a deal. Unfortunately, there's too much leverage by the Chinese Communist Party to determine the outcome of that deal, and that's my concern.
Another concern that we have with China is its human rights record, both its export of surveillance technology to authoritarian regimes like Venezuela and Iran, but also its repression inside its own borders. One case that many in DC are particularly worried about is the case of Pastor Ezra Jin, who has been under surveillance and arrest for a few months now. Can you update us on the latest on his case and what the Trump administration can be doing to ensure that religious freedom and religious liberty violations are not swept under the rug?
I know the president and, we've got a great Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who I think is really an asset for our country. And I know that a number of cases were brought up. I don't know if all of the cases and the timing of that meeting with Xi Jinping. I know Jimmy Lai's case was brought up. And look, it's one of those things where we can bring those issues up, but we have to realize the Chinese Communist Party, their number one goal is to stay in control. And anything that threatens that control whether it's faith, whether it's people talking about freedom, they will push back and clamp down. And unfortunately, they have the capabilities now with surveillance to monitor, censor, and they've done a very effective job in public relations to say nothing to see here. So I think the more we can publicize these cases, and I met with Pastor Jin's daughter, who wonderful person, and her husband, and when you hear these stories, you say, how can, Xi Jinping promotes himself as this person who seems so reasonable, but what's going on behind the scenes is a very different picture. And I think these are just good examples of that. What leverage do we have? I think we need to keep making the case on this. It's a little bit like, I still remember when Mike Pompeo talked to a group of us after he had been CIA director and Secretary of State, and the Olympics were going to happen in China, and he was basically advocating for the U.S. not participating in Olympic. And I remember at the time thinking, well, isn't our goal to engage and try and influence, and then the more media coverage of the negatives going on, then wouldn't that be a good thing to expose? And his point was, they're not going to have that media coverage. The U.S. is not going to have that kind of access to portray a negative story. And that really was a turning point for me, because the whole world is looking, and they have controlled it to such a point, and it was almost like the world didn't really pay that much attention. And I think in cases like this, and I asked Pastor Jin's family, I said, now, does it help you the more we talk about it, or does it hurt you? And their point was, we think people need to know and make the case. And so that's what the policy I have on that.
I think you raised a really important point, which is that she views the love of Christ and God as a threat to himself, because of course he wants to be the highest and most beloved, and this is why faith, and particularly Christian faith, is seen as such a threat by him. So I'm grateful for everything that you've done to raise awareness of Xi's violations of religious freedom.
Can I make one point, and I would just make this appeal to all of you. We have the 250th anniversary of our Declaration of Independence, and when you look at the principles and, endowed by our Creator, unalienable rights, and you contrast that with what's happening in China, where, those aren't unalienable rights. In fact, there aren't rights. It's really what the government directs. We have a wonderful opportunity to talk about the uniqueness of our foundation. We haven't always lived up to the promise. I mean, let's be honest about that. But what we have in the contrast, I think, could be a really important time to help elevate some of these issues that you're talking about.
I have 1 to 2 more questions, and then I'll turn to the audience for the remainder of the time. You recently joined the board of the National Endowment for Democracy, which has been the target of some attacks recently within the conservative movement. Why was it important for you to join the NED, and what do you think the best role for the organization is in America's foreign policy and national security?
I think it gets back to some of these founding principles and trying to work with like-minded countries and like-minded individuals who help raise these issues. And, I'm a believer, America first doesn't mean America alone. We need allies. We need like-minded nations working together. If we're going to have export controls, we need other countries, the Dutch, the Japanese, working with us on these kinds of things. And so, some would say, hey, we shouldn't fund any of this. What's in our national interest? You look at just our history, when we have worked together with like-minded countries, we are so much stronger. And that doesn't mean funding everything that's been funded by, because there's some crazy stuff that gets funded in the government, which should never happen in the first place. But those principles, to me, are worth And I think I take lessons from Ronald Reagan during the Cold War, where he talked about, having a technology advantage, military advantage, but also the ideological advantage in speaking directly to the Russian people and people in Poland and people where you can create allies. And so I do think there's an important role for soft power, if you will, but it has to be in our national interest. And to me, that's the criteria. And so I thought it's better to be involved and part of it rather than just saying, okay, this hasn't always met the standard that we'd hoped for and therefore don't have anything to do with it.
Last question from me. As we transition to the second year of the Trump presidency and the 119th Congress, what are your main priorities that you hope the committee can achieve over the course of the next year?
We have a lot at stake right now on some legislation that has been introduced, whether it's outbound investment legislation, biosecure legislation. You mentioned the research security kind of safe research, chip location, chip security. There's so much that we need to have a consensus with Congress, with the White House, and have it be a bipartisan consensus. That's not happening everywhere in Congress right now. It's not happening politically in our country, but I think we do have the opportunity to help make that happen through the work of our committee. So that, to me, is going to be a major goal. We have differences of opinion on, some of you, have you ever heard the term the Overton window? Anybody, who's heard that term? Does anyone know where that term came from? So when I was in my late 20s, before both Joe Overton and I got married, we were roommates in Midland, Michigan, and he was working at a think tank called the Mackinac Center, a private public policy state-based group, and he was the vice president there. And he was more of a libertarian, I was more of a conservative, and so we'd have all these conversations. And I think he got frustrated with me at times when I didn't see it exactly how he did, and then he would talk to other political people and say, well, why aren't you doing this policy right away? And it's like, well, my constituents don't support it. We haven't made the case. And so he kind of developed this concept that politicians only act within the Overton window. I can't remember why I came up with this. What was the original question?
Your goals for the 119th Congress.
Okay, thank you. So we have an Overton window here where we need to bring the American people along. And we need to communicate in a way that brings conservatives, libertarians, Democrats that are interested in national security on board, because we need a policy for America to win this competition. And to me, that's kind of an example of the Overton window, where we got to do everything we can within this window to make it happen.
Open it up to questions from the audience. My colleague Ethan will be wandering with a microphone, so just raise your hand. Yes, this gentleman right here. Just wait for the microphone if you don't mind, and introduce yourself as well.
Thank you, Chairman, for being here. My name is Jason Shru. I'm a senior fellow at Hudson Institute and a former legislator from Taiwan. Very grateful for your support for Taiwan. One question to follow up your comments on Prime Minister Takaichi's comments on China. And there are two sets of readouts of US White House readout. Didn't mention President Trump's likely to call Takaichi on not being too overtly talking about Taiwan, and then leading up to his potential visit next April. What could the committee and yourself do to ensure that America's principle is upheld in terms of security and promises to the Indo-Pacific region for that regard? Thank you, and again, very grateful.
It's a great question, and first of all, thank you. Wow, I didn't realize we had someone with your background helping on these policy issues, which is fantastic. our committee early on did a report, 10 for Taiwan, that made different recommendations. We are actually working on a follow-up to that report that will outline some of the priorities. Today I had the chance in our National Security and Related Agencies Subcommittee to ask the Assistant Secretary for Indo-Pacific and State Department, kind of where are we with some of the different backlogs for foreign military sales, and I think we need to keep that on the radar screen because we've been behind, we haven't fulfilled all our commitments to Taiwan, and we need to make sure we do, and I think that's really important. The other thing that's really important, I think, first of all, the representative from Taiwan, our Ambassador he does a fantastic job helping people understand, and I think that building those relationships is really going to be important and continue to be important. So I don't want to preempt our release of our report because we got to make sure we get that out there. But look forward to that. And then I would welcome one of the challenges for me, and I've been to Taiwan, we've met with the leadership. There's political divides there like there are in this country. And finding ways to get people on the same page there is similar to here. And I guess my question would be, what can we do in that arena to help make that happen? Because the level of defense spending, even the level of trust with China's intentions, it really varies, as you know, in Taiwan. And I think us sharing information is going to be really important to that. But clearly, Xi Jinping, has instructed his military to be prepared by 2027 to take Taiwan by force if necessary. And that doesn't mean they will, but when I view their exercises, it looks like rehearsals. And when you see the rhetoric, when you see the way they have tried to change the narrative, one of my goals is going to be in the new year to have another hearing on helping people understand the history of Taiwan. The CCP's never governed Taiwan. And to help people understand this relationship, how important that is to the United States, and continue to highlight that because clearly Xi Jinping is making this a huge priority right now. And, so I think we have a lot at stake, and I would welcome your insights on this.
Yeah. Other questions? Yes, please. I like to make Ethan run as
Great,
far
you're doing a great job. He's getting his steps in. Thank you so much for your leadership. It is just really wonderful to hear your thoughts, and I'm grateful. Nicole Bivens-Sadaka from the George W. Bush Presidential Center. Would love to appreciate your inclusion of the ideological element of this battle, which is a battle that spans military, economic, technological. Would love to hear where you see opportunities for us to strengthen that component, whether that's vis-a-vis China or in just supporting democratic actors around the world in other places that right now are being lured by China to align with them.
Yeah, I think, and President Bush was great at this, building relationships. And we're looking at what's happening in Central and South America right now. And there is a perception that America has neglected some of our friends, neighbors. And, that perception, it doesn't always have to do with money. I think it has to do also with, how are we trying to work together? What kind of relationships are we building? So I'm putting kind of a premium on what can we do to build relationships. Sometimes it's funding a project, but we're never going to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative financially, but we do have private markets. We do have different government policies where we can incentivize the private sector to invest and help. I know one area like Guatemala, for instance. They're under tremendous pressure from China because they recognize Taiwan. And, China's offering to build different things and try and push the U.S. out of I think it's important that we build these relationships and make sure that, we try and find win-win scenarios. And so whether it's different people in this hemisphere or, other countries, I was shocked, actually. We were in Vietnam, and we heard of a poll that like 80% of Vietnam approves of America. It was shocking to me because I watched the Ken Burns, Vietnam history on the way over on the plane, and I'm trying to be as informed. And then I get there, and it was remarkable. But that has to do with how do we build relationships, and China, because of their manipulative, self-serving actions, has damaged a lot of relationships, and I think it just kind of comes down to that. And it's not always government to government. I think sometimes some of our government institutions have actually worked against that, sadly. But PEPFAR would be a great example of something we did that has really done amazing things in Africa. So, yeah.
Dan Rundy in the back.
Uh-oh, don't give him the microphone.
Uh-oh.
One of the first things I did when I took this new job was read his book. So, yeah, good to see you.
Thank you. It's still on sale if you... Thank you, Chairman. I'm Dan Rundy. I'm a senior advisor at CSIS. Thanks, Vandenberg Coalition, for pulling this together. I'm also on the advisory committee for the Vandenberg Coalition. So I want to thank you first for your really important leadership. I think you have been a really important voice on, I think, the most critical foreign policy issue that we have. So thank you for your really important public service. I'm really grateful. I know everyone here, the fact they showed up is a way of saying thank you and their gratitude, so thank you. I have two suggestions. I loved the hearings. I saw the hearing on minerals that you did. Thank you very much, really important. Let me suggest that could you consider doing a field hearing, an unofficial field hearing, either in Taiwan itself, which may be a little edgy, but why not, or in Japan or South Korea, and invite parliamentarians from all the parties in Taiwan to come, but perhaps doing something in Taipei to raise awareness about the history and the border issues, but also to hammer home that they better spend the $40 billion. Because we got a problem, because if they don't cough up more money, we're gonna have a problem. They need to spend more money on their own defense. I'm a friend of Taiwan, you're a friend of Taiwan. They're spending 3% of GDP. I don't know what South Korea spends, but it's more than 3%. And I know Israel spends more than 3%, so come on. So my view is, I think there's an opportunity for you to kind of hammer that home by doing an actual hearing. You might even, or doing a hearing here, but I think it would be even better there if it was overseas, on the issue of what is Taiwan doing to further get its act together to defend itself. Let me just suggest something else, which is that I hope they spend the $40 billion, but let me suggest that I just came back from Ukraine, and I did a piece, and I'll send it to you, Congressman, on the fact that the Ukrainians have the answer to Taiwan's defense problems. Historically, there's been a temptation, this is my simplistic generalist understanding of this, to buy the equivalent of aircraft carriers. They want to buy aircraft carriers and inappropriate technologies because they're shiny toys. Now, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's something in that zip code. What they really need is 4 million or 5 million Ukrainian technology drones. And Taiwan should be signing licensing agreements with Ukraine. So I'd love for you to consider doing either a hearing or some sort of a report on the opportunities for Ukraine and Taiwan to cooperate on defense tech. And your committee's uniquely positioned to do this. And one last point, it's not so easy for Ukraine and Taiwan to talk to each other. Ukraine and Taiwan don't recognize each other. And there are people in Ukraine who think that the Chinese Communist Party is their plan B if for some reason America flakes on them, or if someone's or they're gonna pressure, she will pressure Putin to get peace. So it's not so easy. I actually think America has to actually bring these two parties together to make that happen. Sorry for the long-winded thing, sorry.
No, those are great ideas, and you know, the lessons from the Russia-Ukraine war are significant in this, and there's similarities, there's differences, but some of the players, yeah, I mean, clearly, you know, when we were talking about the Olympics, you know, I still remember that long meeting with Xi Jinping and Putin and them talking about their lifelong friendship, no limits partnership, and obviously Russia. And the shocking thing for me is when you think of Macron, for instance, I'll use him as an example. You know, one day talking about we may need to send, you know, French troops in to defend Ukraine, and then a week later he's going over figuring out how they can do more business with China. I'm thinking, is there not a connection here? And so I think all these issues need to be explored and in a public way that helps educate all of us. So thank you.
Okay, last question we had right here. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Tanya Latic here from the EU Embassy. I've just come to DC about a month and a half ago, so I'm a newbie and still, yeah, thank you so much. Really fascinating stuff. I've picked up on what you've said, that America first is not America alone. Of course, we like to hear that. So I'd be very interested to hear your views when it comes to the prospect of transatlantic cooperation and reaching all these different objectives that you've listed when it comes to the relationship with China. I think the EU is aligned in many ways. We've also been stepping up in the region, developing security partnerships with Japan, with Korea. There's also a military channel that we have at EU level with the PLA, which we can leverage much more. So I'm interested in your view in leveraging these for our common objectives. How can we show together the soft power that we've talked about? We also had, by the way, an EU-US naval exercise in the Indo-Pacific 2 years ago. You know, stuff like that shows that we stand together. So grateful for your views.
Very important, and it's very important to our committee. I don't know if you knew this, but our plan was to go visit Brussels and visit the Netherlands, talk some of the export controls with the Netherlands and some of the chip technologies, and we were going to meet with, you know, parliamentarians, and then we had this thing called a record government shutdown, and so the trip got canceled. But we do plan to reschedule, and look forward to your help in, you know, making those discussions beneficial to all. So would welcome that. I think it's really important, very important. And I think, you know, we've tried to be available for delegations that come and discuss these issues. And, you know, that was our goal, to be available to, you know, meet with people. But unfortunately, the government shut down.
Well, with that, I know there are a ton more questions, so I apologize that we can't get to everybody, but I'm so grateful to you, Congressman, for joining us, and as Dan said, for all of your hard work defending the United States against the CCP's influence. And thank you all so much for joining us. We will be putting this online if you want to rewatch it or share it with your friends. So thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's great to be with you today. Thanks.